last-minute shakeup at 5:30 a.m., laundry situation not good. And when your focus is on helping your clients, it's easy to forget about yourself. But NASM knows trainers.
Morning ride is okay.
And staying in front of the day isn't always
Nice
as simple
ride.
as 1,
What's
2,
up?
3. So when the unexpected has you pressing pause,
What's the latest on creatine?
I'm going to get back to you on that.
let NASM1 help you press play. Visit NASM.org to sign up for a membership today.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Strong Mind, Strong Body. I'm so glad you joined me today because I'm so excited about my guest. I have Dr. Adrienne Youdim on, and she is the author of Hungry for More, Stories and Science to Inspire Weight Loss from the Inside Out. So I'm your host, Angie Miller, and today's topic is starving for self-love, why we eat our emotions. We know that beyond physical cravings lie this kind of deeper appetite for acceptance and connection and self-worth. And that's what Dr. Youdim is going to help us do, is kind of unravel that complex relationship between food and our emotions so that you can learn ways to nourish your soul without turning to the fridge. So, Adrienne, I'm going to bring you in and have you introduce yourself. How are
Hi,
you doing?
Angie. How are you? So glad to be with you today.
I'm super glad to be with you as well. And so I assume that it's okay to call you Adrienne, or would you prefer Dr. Youdim?
Oh no, I'm Adrienne here.
All right, wonderful. So, you've written this book, you've built an entire practice around, I think, this being hungry for more, how food is so much more than actually being hungry. There's so much emotion that lies in our decisions. There is, fatigue hunger, there's emotional hunger, there's stress hunger, all the things. And I think we would be hard pressed to find somebody who can't relate to that. But my first question for you is, in your practice, what's the most surprising emotional hunger that you've encountered that was masquerading as physical hunger?
You know, it's interesting when we think about emotional hunger, I think our minds always go to feelings of sadness or distress. But the truth is that any kind of difficult emotion, even if it's merely boredom, that can lead for a desire to soothe. And I think we saw this really over the pandemic, where our lives were kind of upended and our routines were upended. And being just merely in the home, feeling boredom, that in of itself can result in a desire to soothe with food. And I think, Angie, it's really important to acknowledge that this is not just something that is happening in the mind, but it's actually rooted in our physiology. We know that when we experience difficult emotions, that our hunger hormones literally get hijacked and move in the direction towards hunger, even when we are fed. So this is, it's validating, I think, to understand that there's a physiologic drive towards eating when we experience difficult emotions.
I'm glad you said that because I do think that what comes with the emotion is shame. Especially, I think, universally, I don't have very many girlfriends or clients, female who haven't experienced some sort of, shall we say, experience with food over the years, whether it was in their teenage years or their adult years. So I like what you said, difficult emotion. And what comes to my mind is difficult emotion always makes us feel like we don't have a sense of agency over our lives, like we've lost control. And so I think that is where we turn to food. But I do love that you mentioned the physiological response, that it's not like we're just completely driven by our emotions, that our physiology of our body responds to that as well. So I hope that that's validating for everyone listening.
And I think if we can move away from shame and really acknowledge this as a opportunity, because when do difficult emotions arise? They're essentially a sign that there's an unmet need. And so if we can lean into that hunger and try and understand what underlies it, then it really is an opportunity to acknowledge the need and to meet our needs where we are at. That makes it even more important from a practical perspective to put aside the shame, because shame gets in the way of really identifying the opportunity that is present in these hungers.
Yeah, 100%. And shame's a dirty, ugly feeling. And so anything we can do to move away from shame and into radical acceptance, I think is key. You also mentioned in your book, correct me if I'm wrong, but that tools cannot restore our sense of self. So, what do you believe is the first step in rebuilding a healthy self image when it comes to our food and our body?
I use a lot of tools in my medical practice. So I do prescribe medications, for example, and I'm all for it. But at the end of the day, it is not just limited to tools, which is why I say that we have to look in, we have to look within to see what exactly that hunger is wanting us to address. And the first step to that, Angie, is really um, engineering pause. So, in that moment that we get triggered by our hunger, and we have this desire to soothe, whether it's with food or with any other distracting thing, be it scrolling on your phone or overworking or shopping, these can all be ways in which we soothe. And so, if somebody doesn't relate to necessarily food being that soothing mechanism, we can extrapolate this to so many other things. But in that moment when we are triggered to do the thing, if we can pause and create kind of this space between that trigger and that reaction, then we can identify what is it that we really need in that moment. Sometimes it's something super practical, right? Like you're sitting at your desk, you've been working all day, and that desire to get up and go to the pantry or to the fridge is really this need for respite. So we need to go outside, get a breath of fresh air, take some time off. Or maybe we are looking for connection. And so what we really need in that moment is to pick up the phone and call our bestie and have a conversation. Or maybe we've been slogging and neglecting our sleep, right? We know that even sleep deprivation, as little as 2 nights of sleep deprivation, in fact, can increase hunger hormones and make us feel a hunger that we then, believe to be nourished or soothed with food. So, really taking a moment and giving ourselves pause so that we can identify what it is that we're really wanting. And I think what people will also acknowledge or identify when they do this is that when we go to food, it's not even scratching the itch, right? So when we try and soothe that hunger with food, we are left still wanting something else.
Yeah.
So if we can use that as an opportunity to see what it is we truly are desiring, then again, it's an opportunity to notice our relationship with food or overworking or whatever the case may be. But more importantly, it's an opportunity to get to the root of what it is we are truly hungry for.
Yeah. That was so well said because one of the first things that I wrote down when you were talking was look within, what's calling you? Because to your point, sleep deprivation is probably the number one thing that does it for me is when I'm not sleeping well, I eat for I'm not sure what. And so the second thing that I wrote is engineering a pause. And in my work, as a therapist, I always call it a breath, right? That space between the trigger and the response. But that pause that says, what do you really need, right? Like, what do you need, Angie? Because you're tired, but food isn't really doing it. In fact, food's probably making you more tired because you're going for the wrong foods. So maybe what you need is just to lie down, give yourself a little respite from the world, if you will. And even if you can't nap, just take that pause. So I like what you say and just kind of telling clients, telling our clients, telling ourselves, just take a pause and check out what's really calling you because food isn't probably even going to squash that hunger, that fake hunger, if you will, anyway. So I know for me, my journey a lot is fatigue, but I'm curious about your journey with food and how your own journey with food and self-love influenced your approach to helping other people.
I want to double down really quickly, Angie, on this issue of sleep. Just recently, I was giving a talk to 60 professional women at Bank of America this past week. And that was the main kind of take home message for a lot of these women. I talk about 5 nutrients, and sleep is one of them. And what I also want to point out is that what is good for us in this endeavor towards a healthy relationship with food and ultimately a healthy relationship with our physical bodies is the very thing that is also important in our emotional and mental well-being, in our relational health, in our professional health. And sleep is something that does impact the physical body, the emotional body, as well as the professional body. And so if we can look at these nutrients more globally, that it's not just a matter of weight loss, which is where our minds will often go, but really a matter of leveling up all the different aspects of our lives, then it allows us to elicit kind of this greater sense of inherent motivation, this greater why for why we are actually doing the thing that we are doing or striving for that goal. It goes beyond the numbers on the scale, but impacts us in so many various aspects of our lives. And sleep definitely does that. To answer your initial question of personal hungers, as you know, in the book Hungry for More, there are about 30, 40 short little chapters, and each chapter represents a hunger for X, whether it's a hunger for self-love or self-compassion, or a hunger for autonomy or agency because you're in a job in which you don't feel like you are in the driver's seat. Or it is a hunger for balance because you're not finding that balance in your life, whether you're leaning in too much into your professional work or into your caretaking as a parent or a caretaker. This sense of imbalance can also elicit a hunger. And as I describe in this book, I can relate to every single hunger that I talk about that is represented in these patient stories, because these hungers really are universal, regardless of whether we are male or female, whether we are professional or not. I have identified these hungers over 20 years of working with clients and patients. And of course, I've found them in myself as well.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I don't think there's a single hunger for that you covered that I can't relate to or I can't remember a client relating to or a girlfriend. It's so true, whether it's that self acceptance or that personal autonomy, that sense of agency of our lives. There's so much that food is kind of that. I don't know, I don't want to call it a drug, but it is that thing that we turn to that we're looking for something and we're not even sure what we're looking for sometimes. So I always want to keep going back to you talking about engineering that pause because I think that's critical. Um, Adrienne, in your book, you talk about the concept of enough being a decision. So, how can someone start to cultivate that mindset, especially if they've struggled with perfectionism? And don't tell anyone, but you might be talking to me on this one. So, the concept of, good enough for now is a really hard one for those of us who are so wired in perfectionism, even after doing lots of work on it, right? So, what is that concept of enough? How do you help cultivate that in your clients?
Well, we are, we live in a culture of striving. And so I don't think you have to be a perfectionist per se or identify as a perfectionist to get caught up in that desire for more. And that can be a very healthy, motivating tool, right? The desire to grow, the desire to do more professionally, the desire to do more personally in your life. But when we are striving for an ideal, which in essence is what perfectionism is. It's not striving for better. It's striving for some ideal that is perfect and that, by the way, does not exist. We are setting ourselves up for failure. So sometimes merely acknowledging that perfectionism actually is not only not feasible, but it is actually defying the objective of doing better, because you were setting yourself up for that failure. And what happens when we feel that we have failed? That invariably is a form of sabotage, right? It makes us less inclined, less motivated to go after that thing. And so I think it's important to redefine perfectionism from what we think is this way of doing better to acknowledging that actually it is a self-defeating prophecy.
Yeah.
Perfectionism is a form of sabotage. So redefining the objective from an ideal to just one thing we can do better. And as I'm talking to you, Angie, I'm remembering a conversation that I had just this past week with a patient of mine who I've known for many years. We worked together several years ago before the pandemic, and he lost about 30, 40 some odd pounds when the pandemic hit and got somewhat derailed. And then I didn't see him for several years, and he came back last year, and he's now hit over 100 pounds of weight loss. And we were talking about what happened or what shifted, right? Like what was different this time. And one of the things that he brought up was that, when he was faced with this goal of 150 pounds of weight loss, it felt like such an insurmountable goal that, thinking about that, uh, invariably kind of upended him. It felt like too much of a hurdle. Whereas this time around, it was like just one thing, the one thing that I can do better than yesterday. I can choose to get up and exercise today or move my body, or I can choose to make that meal or prep that meal or opt against that extra glass of wine. It's like just one thing better than yesterday that, when done in succession, ultimately allows us to achieve that huge objective, that huge hurdle of 150 pounds. And so again, when we think about, how we can reframe our goals from perfect, from 150 pounds, from that ideal to the one thing we can do in this moment, it's not aspirational. It's not like this kumbaya. It is actually effective means of truly achieving that objective one step at a time. And you wake up, a year later and you're like, wow, holy cow, I actually did that big thing.
See, and I really appreciate that you bring this up, Adrienne, because that's the thing, right? You talked about perfectionism actually being like this idealized thing that we think we need to achieve, and it's like a desire for more. But like all of us on some level have some perfectionistic tendencies, in the sense that all of us have a desire for more on some level. But what I really, really love is like that one right thing. I do a lot with motivational interviewing and kind of talking about, giving people agency over their lives, and what are things that they can do and how can they drive the car instead of me telling them what to do, because we are all the best person to fix our own problems. And that one right thing, I remember like a year ago, a friend of mine said, and my friend, she introduced us, said, just what's one right thing you can do today? Just knowing that I get grappled in the whole, oh my gosh, here's the big picture. And even though I can tell my clients how to break things down into pieces, my clients in both fitness and my clients in mental health, I do struggle on a personal level to take things in their full capacity. And so that whole one right thing, or that one thing you can do better today, is powerful. It's when someone looks at I have to lose 100 pounds, or I've got this huge change in my life and it's so overwhelming and I don't even know how to tackle it, that they just sort of crumble under the pressure. But to your point, if we can help them extract the little pieces, I think that's a powerful, powerful thing. And Adrienne, I want to reintroduce you. So I'm Angie Miller. This is Strong Mind, Strong Body. I'm talking to Adrienne Youdim, who wrote Hungry for More. She's such a powerful guest because she talks about that hunger that is driven by so many other things other than the fact that we're actually hungry. So, Adrienne, I have another question for you, and I hope I did a good job of kind of putting context to that situation. But when you're dealing with someone on a day to day basis, how do you, with your patients, actually help them on a kind of granular level differentiate between what is physical hunger and what is emotional hunger? Because I think that that's the first step. Is you can't really differentiate if you've never had somebody working with you or giving you the information that you need.
There is, there's so many directions that I can take in terms of answering this question. And we talked about the pause initially, which again, I think is really important. Identifying, that trigger, and then giving ourselves the opportunity to discern what that trigger or what that moment is really calling from us. But we can, if we can, Angie, take even a step back further and talk about a little bit about how we can nourish ourselves. Um, and I like to talk about nutrients in a more global perspective, in a more holistic perspective. And I talk about 5 main nutrients. The first, of course, is food, but there's other things, other nutrients like movement, like sleep, nature, and those contemplative or spiritual practices like breathing or journaling or meditating that actually elicit that pause. But there are other things that we can do, that we can give to ourselves in order to help us engineer that, because we are reactionary, and that reaction is also hardwired in our neurobiology. When we experience a threat, our bodies are created to respond just like that. And that is something that we evolved because of being in the wild. So there was a time when we had real threats like lions and tigers. And so our bodies were created in a way to respond to that threat quickly, not sit around and critically think and pontificate about the next step, right? Like, you have to get out of harm's way now. The problem is that we no longer live in that environment in which the threat is the lion, in which the threat is really tied to our physical survival. The threat now is social media, or lack of belonging, or political instability, financial instability, the turmoil that is around the world. And if you look at what's going on around us right now in this moment in time, Angie, what's happening in our election cycle and in our politics, what's happening around the world in terms of being engaged and involved in various wars, what's happening in our college campuses with all of this upheaval, to me, all of these things are a manifestation of reactivity. So the question becomes, how do we temper that very real and physiologic reaction, right? This is not about judging. This is not about blaming, because that reactivity is hardwired in our neurobiology. However, if we operate from that template, not only are we soothing with food and alcohol and smoking or what have you, which is harmful to our health, but if we are acting from that template, we are impacting our relational health. We are impacting our professional health, because we cannot be intentional in our decision making. We are impacting our financial health, because we can't make sound decisions. We are making reactive decisions. So I encourage people to engage in these nutrients because they literally help us to temper that reactivity. And I know that a lot of the people listening right now are intimately engaged with movement and exercise. And in this culture, we insist on equating exercise with weight loss, right? And as you know, like they really have nothing to do with each other, right? Like exercise is really not the means to achieve weight loss. But there's so much more power in moving our bodies. And for me, it is a spiritual practice, right? Moving your body so that you can move that anxiety, you can move that reactivity so that you get it out on the mat or you get it out in that run. So you're not discharging that reactivity on the people and the places around you. That really is a nutrient, right? And so if we can get people who don't know how to engineer this pause because we are so wrapped up, we are so habitually reactive, I encourage people to take a step back and start to nourish themselves with these nutrients. And when we do that, not for an objective, but just for the purpose of nourishing ourselves, people will find that they are better able to create and to engineer that pause in their life.
Yeah. Well, and I was kind of hanging on all of your words and taking some notes, and it's always interesting to hear the way that other professionals present information, if you will. And I find that I can learn from language, I can learn from feeling, I can learn from being present in this space with you. And I hope everyone else can too. Because to your point, a lot of us are movement driven or we're wellness coaches. And I like that idea of tempering reactivity because what I want to say, along with the whole idea of tempering reactivity, Adrienne, and to all of you, is aside from those nourishing things that you talked about, the food, the movement, the nature, the spiritual, and the sleep, I think the one thing I'd really like to say is self-compassion. It's kind of an of course phenomenon. Like my daughter worked with a therapist years ago who used to say, of course, like, of course that person would answer that way, because why would you expect anything different? It's like you're trying to expect a person who is highly reactive not to be reactive when of course you know that they're going to be reactive. It's kind of a way of saying of course, not in a surrender way, but in a way of saying things are more maybe predictable than we think they are. And in that space, in that acceptance space of saying we can vote, but we cannot truly determine what lies ahead, right? There's only one right thing we can do today. We can go cast our vote. We cannot determine the outcome. And so I think by tempering reactivity, a little bit of self-compassion, of knowing that, yes, you can do your part, but you cannot control all the variables, meaning other people and outcomes in our world. And so I think if we have some compassion for that, we are going to be less reactive. We're going to get into less triggering conversations with people where we try to change their mind or expect them to think like us. And so, but also internalizing that instead of the shaming and the blaming and the self-loathing that comes from our clients or ourselves when we overeat or emotionally eat or we're driven to food. How about just of course I feel reactive today because I have a huge schedule or I have a boss who's expecting crazy things. And so if we can invite self-compassion in, I think we could temper the reactivity that drives us to want to eat. What are your thoughts about that whole self-compassion piece?
Yeah, I think I'm so glad you brought that up. That is so important. And also, I want to double down on one of the points that you made, which is that sometimes people feel like self-compassion is, you mentioned surrender or an excuse or like letting ourselves off the hook. And that's actually not at all what it is. We can be self-compassionate and yet have those goals or those desires in mind. And having self-compassion allows us to get back into the ring and to engage in those goals. In a way, lack of self-compassion, in a way, is kind of a scapegoat, because what happens when we blame and we shame ourselves? Then we kind of unravel and we go down that rabbit hole of feeling depowered or having this lack of agency that you brought up earlier. And so we kind of take the wind out of our own wings when we go down that place of self-deprecation. Whereas when we can meet ourselves with self-compassion, when you can say, of course, this is a natural reaction to the current happenings, then we are able to operate from that grounded place and to get back to the work of doing what we need to do in order to meet and achieve that objective. So I would love for people to acknowledge and to reframe self-compassion away from what we do in a societal way, which is that it is a scapegoat, to actually acknowledging that, no, it is a means to an end. It's a means to achieving our objective. And when we can operate from that place of self-understanding and self-acceptance, as opposed to self-deprecation and self-loathing, then we are better able. We have the agency that we need in order to achieve that objective in the long run.
100%, because what came to my mind when you were talking about that was we victimize ourselves. We gaslight ourselves. It's the same way when we blame other people. Well, if it's their fault, there's nothing I can do. It's kind of the same thing. Well, if I'm just whatever, then there's nothing I can do. We sort of surrender to ourselves, and it's almost like victimizing ourselves. So, Adrienne, I feel like you and I could have a million conversations, and I hope to have you back on, and we'll continue the conversation. But I do want to ask, how can listeners reach you? Tell us, about your book. And I know you host a podcast, and just give them an idea of where they can reach you.
Yes, I mean, yes, we could talk forever, and I muse on this stuff all the time. The best way is really reaching out through the website, dradrienneyoudim.com, and there you can find a link to the book, Hungry for More. I have a podcast called Health Bite, a weekly newsletter where I give these small actionable bites towards greater health and well-being. I also have a course in mind-body medicine that is being launched after the new year to address this very issue of how to use mind-body skills to manage our reactivity so that we can show up, so that we can live, lead, and love with intention and clarity and purpose. And you can also find me on LinkedIn and Instagram at Dr. Adrienne Youdim.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Adrienne. I really appreciate you coming on. I appreciate all of you listening to our episode today about starving for self-love, why we eat our emotions. So do reach out if you have any questions, and I will see you next week.